Sometime in the future, historians will be looking back at our time. They'll be surrounded by the ruin of everything that we achieved. And they'll be wondering how a mere sports league worth a paltry few £1 billion a year could have destroyed so much of what humanity had wrought. After all, if you believe what's written about Premier League footballers and their salaries, their clubs and their behaviour, they're basically responsible for practically every bad thing about society, bar nothing. And in order to work out how we could have gotten from playing football to destroying everything humanity had ever achieved, they're going to look for a fulcrum point, a change in the progress of events, and I think they're going to alight on May of 2015 as the critical moment. That wasn't the date that the Premier League was founded. It's been around since the early 90s. May of 2015, I think, was the date that the Premier League became self-aware and began to learn at a geometric rate. How else is it possible to explain Leicester City? That May was the time of a racist orgy by Leicester City players. They videotaped it, they shared the video with their friends, who shared it with the media, who shared it with the world. And what it kicked off wasn't the decline and ruin of Leicester City Football Club as you would expect. You know, I realise that sports players get away with a lot, but racist orgy sex tapes are worse than most things they get away with, and you would have expected everything to go all wrong for the club. After all, the people involved in this were ambassadors for Leicester City abroad. The people who they were essentially victimising in the tape were Thai women. Leicester City is owned by a Thai billionaire, and his fortune was essentially handed to him by the Thai government, awarding an immense contract to supply duty-free in the biggest airport in Thailand. So Leicester City players racially abusing Thai women while involved in depraved orgiastic sex with them is a bad look, and you would expect it to have bad consequences. But instead, this moment kicked off a 5,000 to 1 Premier League win by a team who had only just barely avoided relegation the prior year. This win was so completely unexpected. 5,000 to 1 is short odds for this, to be honest. You would take 5,000 to 1, and several people did. Because the chances of Leicester winning the league are way, way, way lower than 5,000 to 1. Now, with regard to this orgy, nobody cares about the players involved. They barely made a ripple at Leicester. They were pretty much never in the first team. I think one of them made a single appearance in 2 years in the league. Their names can be comfortably lost to history forever and left lost. But the scandal claimed the scalp of their manager, Nigel Pearson. One of the people involved in the orgy was his son. He only lasted about a month after the release of the tape. He was replaced by Claudio Ranieri. Claudio Ranieri took the team all the way to the title. So we've gone from essentially involuntary pornography of the kind that would nowadays probably be considered a very serious criminal matter, through to winning the league in a single year under a new manager who wouldn't have been there if it weren't for this massive scandal. Now, the following year, they sacked Ranieri because he wasn't doing quite as well as winning the league the following year. The year after, they sacked his replacement, Craig Shakespeare. The year after that, They sacked Craig Shakespeare's replacement, Claude Puel. Then they appointed Brendan Rodgers, and he's still there. He's in the upswing. He's on his pre-sacking run of good form. And it remains to be seen if the COVID lockdown is going to go on for long enough that he'll get to be the longest serving Leicester City manager since Nigel Pearson. Maybe it will. Maybe, though, they'll come back in summer, he'll lose a few matches and his job, as is the new tradition at the club. But Leicester City's success was supposed to herald a sea change, right? They were supposed to be the kind of club who doesn't win the Premier League going to win the Premier League. And as things turned out, they were going to recede back to being a kind of a mid-table, decent side without troubling the top again. They're doing very, very well this year. They're winning a lot, but this year is a bit of a write-off. Normally, that kind of sudden, unexpected spike in success in sport involves regular appointments at a dodgy Italian doctor's surgery. But not this time. See, though Leicester had this billionaire sugar daddy, this Thai family, I suppose you'd call it, consortium maybe is a better word, who bankrolled them. They did the win with the kind of players who you wouldn't normally associate with this kind of largesse, right? Jamie Vardy, the star striker of that team, was late of Fleetwood Town. When he signed with Leicester, Fleetwood Town were not even in the Football League, okay? Their marquee signings in 2015, the year they won the league, was N'Golo Kante from French relegation regulars Cannes for 5.6 million, and Shinji Okazaki from Mainz 05, also a bit of a yo-yo club in Germany, for 7 million. This is hardly 200 million quid for Neymar to buy yourself the title, is it? Now, Vardy was previously famous only for commenting "chat shit, get banged" in approval of a video of common assault, okay? And it might have stayed that way until the tiny pebble of a racist orgy grew into the avalanche of a Premier League win, and he scaled the heady heights of becoming the subject of Tinchy Strider lyrics and, an on-spec Hollywood script that never is ever going to get made. It was a feel-good win. These were people who were not meant to be doing this, and they weren't bought in for the purpose, It was supposed to show us that there's another way in the Premier League besides money, besides pumping tons and tons of cash into a team that was never there and was never going to win. Like a kind of a particularly rare and beautiful tulip in a 17th century Dutch auction house. More and more and more money until, some kind of magic happens and you make money back. Well, you don't, usually, The idea was that Leicester City were not a cynical assault on the values of football, all right? But they still managed to win. That kind of forgets the whole point of the Premier League, which is sort of why we're here today, right? The Premier League began as a TV exercise. Greg Dyke, famous later as Director General of the BBC and one of the subjects of the Hutton Inquiry, among various other things, a director of the Football Association, was at the time working at a private TV studio in London, called LWT. And at LWT, he did a quick whip around of all of the top clubs in the country at the time and suggested making a breakaway league. He thought if you didn't have to televise all of the dross, no matter how much people loved the dross because it's their home team, the less marketable, less famous, less bankable teams would be chaff. And he would winnow them out of the wheat of what would become the Premier League. It was a TV deal before the league ever existed. The idea was to foreground these people on television make them bankable. Okay? Ironically, ITV, who would have been LWT's broadcaster for this, didn't get to have the Premier League. They did this at exactly the wrong time for LWT, because what was coming around right then was Sky and satellite TV, and they bid millions, unanswerable millions, and they lifted the new Premier League straight out of the lap of the people who had intended to benefit from it. And the BBC, of all people, managed to outbid them for the match of the day rights, the highlights package on Saturday and Sunday night. So they got nothing out of it, which is appropriate because they wanted to turn it into a money vehicle, and it turned out that they weren't the people with the most money. This would happen again and again throughout the history of the Premier League, right? In its early days, it was dominated by the old school clubs, okay? In particular, Manchester United to begin with, then Manchester United and Arsenal, okay? And that was all through the first 10 odd years. But then money arrived. What had been a fairly cozy kind of a situation for the likes of Arsenal in particular, who lost out badly because of this, and Manchester United, suddenly turned into a situation where people like Manchester City, bankrolled by Emiratis, Chelsea, bankrolled by Russian oligarchs, began to win regularly, and they began to beat the old school clubs whose financial success was basically based on football still, okay? All of this massive TV rights deal had only really come along in the last decade, all right? And the people who were still doing very well at the top were still the people who had been doing very well in the past before the mega books came in. But they brought the mega books in and then looked absolutely shocked when it turned out that there were other sources of piles and piles of cash than their own TV deal. And they scrambled to keep up. Well, Leicester got on this bandwagon relatively late, but the upshot of that was that they didn't go out and spend 200 million on Neymar and buy the league. This is the allegation that's often levelled at Chelsea and especially at Manchester City, that they take dodgy money from sources that are themselves dodgy. They spend it in ways that is unsustainable, and they get away with it, and they keep the trophies. Okay? You can look into investigations into these people because they now have financial fair play rules. They now have essentially sports legislation that prevents running at a loss deliberately, that prevents pretending that you negotiated a good sponsorship deal when actually your sponsor just handed you all the money as a bung. They're under investigation for this of Man City in particular, and it's making a difference to an extent, a little bit. But the point with Leicester was that they were not this. Whatever happened with the millions that came in from Thailand, it didn't get spent on inflated salaries for players, massive transfer fees, and buying the title, but they got the title anyway. Okay? Unfortunately, football didn't learn. But before we talk about that, as is becoming the way on this show, we have to talk about something else. We have to talk about fitness. If you ask a Premier League fan about fitness, they might well tell you fitness as a concept was brought to the Premier League by Arsene Wenger in 1996. At the time, it was seen a little bit like diving, a dangerously foreign idea that proper English footballers wouldn't have anything to do with. As it turned out, just like diving, English football was powerless to resist the appeal of fitness. Now players zip around the pitch like actual athletes. Pizza is something Claudio Ranieri awards you for keeping a clean sheet, and a glancing contact with another player's elbow provokes a reaction like Sonic the Hedgehog dropping all his rings. But we aren't talking about that kind of fitness. The kind of fitness we're talking about is fitness to be director of a football club, or an owner, or even on the board. Anyone who wants to run a football club has to pass a series of tests, okay? These tests are designed to ensure that anyone in charge of a football club is fit and proper to be so, okay? And the tests cover things like not rendering a club insolvent twice in unrelated matters, not secretly running some other club that you might have a conflict of interest in, or owning another club, or being bankrupt yourself while you're in charge of a football club. And you can see that these are sensible things. I mean, these clubs are run as businesses, and you don't want people getting in charge of them because they love football while being awful at business, and then everyone else has to pick up the shattered remnants of the club and get it back on the horse. Just ask any Rangers supporters how that goes. You can, however, be a fit and proper person to own a football club if you were convicted of the rape and indecent assault of a 16-year-old girl in 1996. Like Owen Oyston, you can continue to be on the board of Blackpool Football Club until 2019. In fact, you can be found by the High Court to have asset stripped the club, and it will still take over a year to remove you. And it will still be the High Court that does it, not the league. Now, Blackpool were in the Premier League in 2010 to 11, okay, before they collapsed down into League One. And Owen Oyston was in charge of Blackpool while they were in the Premier League. They didn't lift a finger to prevent him from being so in charge. And what I'm getting at here is that ownership of a Premier League club is not limited to those you would trust to run the club well. It's not even limited to those you would trust to run a pub five-a-side team well. You can be somebody who can't be trusted to be in the same room as a teenager and still run a Premier League football club. You can imagine that presents some challenges to the Premier League. Okay? That means that certain people can get in charge of clubs who patently and obviously have no interest in running them well or properly. They're interested only in, for instance, money or prestige or sports washing. Sports washing being the idea that if you associate yourself with sporting achievement or with sporting competition, the reflected glow of our love for sport gets on you. You know, if you are, for instance, a pseudo-dictator of a major Eastern European country and you decide to put on the Olympics in Sochi, you can know for a fact that everyone will put aside their differences and stop criticizing because there are teenagers from China and this is their only hope of a medal and we all need to get behind them and give them a good day. You know? People love that stuff. And it's very hard to be cynical in the face of sporting achievement. Obviously, you have to be cynical in the face of sporting achievement sometimes, right? That Italian doctor I mentioned earlier is one of those cases. You know, if you're a cycling fan, you have been put through the ringer in the last 20 or 25 years, trying to find anything in your sport anywhere that you can trust or believe in that's good. And realizing that actually there's not that much in there that you can trust or believe in that's good, that it is corrupt through and through from knowing about the doping that's going on and continuing the sport regardless, you know? Yet, the Tour de France still rubs its glory on everyone involved with it, you know? You still see the prestige associated with it around France. People still want, you know, the Tour often starts its first stage in a foreign country. You know, sometimes it's just like Belgium, but occasionally they go overseas literally and they run a stage of the Tour before they get going. People love that. People still want it in spite of all the negative publicity around cycling in general and tour cycling specifically. You know, you've still got the United Kingdom pumping money and more prestige into track cycling, in spite of the association of certain track cyclists with this kind of stuff through, the teams that they're involved with in, what you might call private cycling or, private cycling teams. This is something where it's almost impossible to shake off the prestige that comes with sport, right? You can be as bad as they come, whether it's in your sport itself, in terms of cheating and so on, or whether it's in terms of your finances or your conduct outside the sport, people will still love it. They're not going to turn away. Look at the upcoming World Cup, Football World Cup in Qatar. Like, they're counting the deaths of people working in order to build the infrastructure to put on a giant football tournament in a place that has no heritage of football at all. Has to build everything from the ground up, and building it from the ground up in order to put this on is killing people. It's still going ahead. A lot of very conscientious people are objecting to this. But, the TV audience will still be there. Maybe some heads of state won't go. A lot of the time you want the heads of state of the different countries to appear in the stadiums, makes the whole thing seem geopolitical as well as just sporting. There's a lot of prestige in that. Maybe some of them won't go because, Qatar has other problems besides just workers dying in construction. Maybe some people won't go. But everyone kind of knows that when it comes to it, if your team, your national side, is at that World Cup, you're going to want them to win. You're going to care if they win. You're going to care if they lose. And so is everyone else. And that glory will be there and it will reflect. And we've seen from the state of politics recently that that's enough. Qatar just pointing to the World Cup over and over again and saying, look how awesome we are, will work on people. And they will gain a great deal from this. So there is a real risk of people owning football clubs for the sake of the prestige, because they want the prestige, who should not be owning anything of any kind. Nobody should be involved with them in any way, shape or form because they are, for instance, corrupt or dangerous or criminal or whatever it is. So they have these tests, but the tests, they only care about bankruptcy. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the foundations on which these professional leagues are built is just investment and churning money through. They don't want anyone involved who's bad at the money side of things. The rest of the stuff, like developing young talent and being a role model to children, that's not on the list of things that makes you unfit to be a football director. Or should I say, director of a football club. Footballing director is a different job. But, there's a long list of things, for instance, in the English Football League and in other leagues and things like that, that disqualify you from being in a club, okay? You're not allowed to have a job in a football club in charge of people if you fail to meet a very long list of requirements. But those are the same as any other job, working with young people or vulnerable people or just having people under your control. You can't have an unspent conviction from recent years. You can't be a registered sex offender, for instance, and so on. But those are not there for the directors because they're considered to be businessmen in charge of a whole company. Investors who may have nothing to do with the day-to-day minutiae of running the club, so they're not there, and therefore they don't get the same scrutiny. And that leaves it all open to people taking over clubs for completely nefarious purposes. And they have, and they do, and it goes on. Okay. And we're going to talk about, finally, the whole point of this episode, which is Newcastle United Football Club. Okay. Newcastle United Football Club was run, or well, still is technically as I'm recording this, run by a guy called Mike Ashley, most recently famous for trying to keep his retail stores open during the COVID-19 lockdown, claiming that people needed to buy exercise bikes for their own health while they're locked in their homes. That didn't go well. The response was not positive from the people of the United Kingdom, and his stores are closed as we speak, which is great. But it tells you the kind of person he is, and when we start talking about his history with that football club with Newcastle United, you're going to know that Newcastle United fans are not having a good time of it. They are about to go out of that particular frying pan and into a much, much worse fire. And we're going to talk about that after this. So yes, we are halfway through this episode of Ev on Everything, which is the moment where I take a moment to ask you to share the podcast, to rate it and subscribe to it, because it's what keeps me going. If you've been enjoying this, or even if you haven't been enjoying it but you're persevering for some reason, if you hit the 5-star button, if you share this on social media, if you leave a short positive review on iTunes in particular, but anywhere that you listen, that helps me immensely. Helps me with all the algorithms that promote the show, helps me make more waves and get more interest in the show, and it helps the whole thing to grow as it has been since we started. We're listened to all over the world. Dozens and dozens or hundreds of new people hear this every week. And if you give me a little bit of help in return for getting the show, I can keep the growth up and we can keep the podcast going. I really want to keep the podcast going because I want to deliver this content to you. I want to give you this entertainment. And I like being a podcaster and I don't want to have to stop. So you can help me with that like and subscribe and share. Also, if you just want to tell me what you think, you can find me on Twitter at Ev Buckley, and you can find the show at Ev on Everything. Those are the best ways to get in touch, but we do also have email. You can email me at evoneverything@gmail.com, and I promise I will reply. Anyway, as usual, thank you so much for listening to the show, and we need to get back to people who are in charge of football clubs who you wouldn't trust with your children, literally. So it bears pointing out specifically that Mike Ashley is not somebody that you can't leave your kids with, okay? As far as I know, he is not remotely, even nearly as terrible a person as Owen Oyston is, okay? What he does do is own Sports Direct, and Sports Direct is a chain of inescapable pits of high street depression. They are everywhere in the UK, and they are where once loved sports brands go to die, right? They're not knockoffs exactly, that's not how it works. He buys the whole brand and then uses them to churn through terrible versions of what otherwise would have been good sportswear, okay? And it is universally reviled, but especially with the modern economy working the way it does, you can't keep down a stack 'em high and sell them cheap approach to something as popular as sportswear. That means Mike Ashley is very, very rich, okay? several billion quid depending on how you count. And he took over Newcastle United in 2007, right? In fairness to the people who wrote those fit and proper rules, you can see why the rules exist when you look at that takeover, okay? Newcastle's then chairman was quoted as saying Ashley and his company would be excellent custodians of Newcastle United's heritage, and that they will provide the best opportunity for the club to flourish in the future to the benefit of the company and its fans. That did not turn out to be true. In fact, it's in the running for being the most untrue statement of all of 2007, and that was a year when Donald Trump claimed his net worth goes up and down with his feelings. Okay? Ashley would not go on to give the appearance that he had the best interests of the club at heart. It was claimed he had failed to assess the club financially at all when he bought it, and he only discovered after buying it that it had debts of £100 million. It was still paying financial obligations on old transfers. It was reported that those who knew him said he bought the club for fun. At the same time, though, he became instantly popular with the fans. He was drinking with them, even when he shouldn't have been. There's a video that I'll link on the show Twitter, at Ev on Everything on Twitter, of him lowering an entire pint of lager in the stands at Arsenal. And you are not supposed to drink in the stands at Premier League football matches. He claimed later he had been given the pint by somebody else and told that it was non-alcoholic. They don't actually sell non-alcoholic beer in the Arsenal ground, but that didn't stop him from hand-waving it away. The police spoke to him about the matter, and I doubt they believed him either. He hired a club legend, Kevin Keegan, as manager. And you have a situation then where a guy who's really pally with the fans, who is injecting money, even though he's injecting it into servicing debt at the time, it's still very important, and he has this club legend in as the manager. Okay? At the same time, though, he could be said by people to be financially irresponsible, having taken over without fully understanding the financial obligations that he was taking on. So going back to this whole, we don't like people taking over football clubs who, are going through bankruptcy or who have run clubs into the ground in the past. Well, you can't castigate people for financial decisions they haven't made yet. You can't point to Mike Ashley and say, well, he's obviously going to run Newcastle United really badly, so we can't let him be a director. But you can say that if you do actively run Newcastle United really badly, then you're not allowed to be director or owner of a football club. Okay? That's why those rules are there. And from that point of view, they make great sense. Going back to the shambles of Blackpool, you could argue that that kind of terrible situation was never meant to be covered by fit and proper rules. They weren't expecting a convicted sex offender to rob the club, But they were intended to cover situations like Mike Ashley at Newcastle. They were intended to prevent somebody whose interest in the club is what you might call less than financially pure from taking over. Whether that's because he considers it a fun toy to play with, as people who knew him apparently said, or whether it's because he just wants to ignore the football, ignore the success of the club and the fans completely, and churn money through the club as fast as possible. Okay? Well, those good times did not last. Not in the finances of the club and not in the football on the pitch. Club legend Kevin Keegan resigned very, very soon after being appointed, only months later. He subsequently won a $2 million settlement for constructive dismissal. And if you've seen what Premier League managers have been fired over or sacked or resigned over, Finding a way to make a settlement stick in a situation like that is incredible. It's unheard of. But that's what happens when you put in a director of football to undermine your club legend. And that guy admits, apparently, to signing players as a favour to overseas agents. Like, imagine that. Imagine saying to the club in general, to the manager who's supposed to be running these players, and to the players themselves who are trying to get through a day of work as a footballer, that some of the players are only there because they want to keep certain agents sweet. Okay? No wonder when Keegan went back and said there's no way I could work under those circumstances. They hired me to do a job. Then they hired somebody else to undermine that job completely, that he won his settlement. It was only 2 million because there was a clause that said it couldn't be more. And it got worse. Okay? They hired another club legend, Alan Shearer, highest scoring goal scorer in Premier League history and highest scorer in Newcastle United's history. They hired him as manager. Now, he was not a very experienced manager at the time, but Newcastle were hovering right above relegation. They were right above the drop, and they only had a few games to sort that out. Surprisingly enough, a naive new manager who didn't have a massive amount of experience did not manage to get them to avoid that drop. Okay? Apparently, again, you never know exactly what happened in these things, but apparently Ashley promised Shearer that he would be allowed to manage his way out of the Championship back into the Premier League, and then he sacked him. Shearer did not like this, so Ashley renamed the Shearer Bar to something else. You know, it's a pretty big deal when they start naming stuff after you in a club, whether it's stands or, you know, bars or even a car park. If they want your name on something every day of every week when the fans are in there, you are a proper legend, beloved by all at the club. Ashley was insane to take on the fans that way, to just be like, I know things didn't work out with this guy who you love perhaps more than any other footballer in the history of the game, but I'm taking his name off the bar because he doesn't like me anymore. You know, petty and vindictive, and designed to make everybody hate you. And this is a guy months before who was boozing it up in the local bars around Newcastle and getting on great with the fans. But it got even worse when there was a footballer called Jonas Gutierrez. And he was a Newcastle player who had a cancer diagnosis and he had to go through chemotherapy. Okay? And he returned to play after the chemotherapy, which is amazing. You know, it's a wonderful thing to have happen. A lot of players with chronic illnesses don't generally make it back to top flight playing. And as a rule, if a club stands by a player, the fans tend to love the club for it. Okay? If you've got someone with a very long-term injury or illness, and if they are nurtured back into the game by the club, even if they never make it at the top level anymore, as a rule, fans respond so well to that. They love it. It makes them feel good about their club and their hierarchy. And you can imagine, it's just a feel-good story. They sacked him. Well, they didn't sack him. They let his contract run out and they didn't either sell him or re-sign him. And he won a discrimination lawsuit against them because they hadn't been picking him after his cancer diagnosis while he was still able to perform, and he was missing out on playing bonuses. You know, you get a bonus for making it into the first team and being played a particular weekend, and he wasn't getting them because they weren't considering him because he had cancer. Again, you can drop a player for anything. You can just say, I don't like the way you tie your laces. I'm worried that you'll trip over them. You're not in the team this weekend. And at least you've given a sensible footballing decision, no matter how crazy it is, to not play that person. Winning a discrimination lawsuit against your employer in that regard is unbelievable. But Gutierrez won it. So that is one club legend and one absolutely beloved kind of golden child of the club who won lawsuits against the club because of decisions that Mike Ashley's people made. It's stunning. It's unprecedented how hated Mike Ashley could get in such short order. Okay? In terms of running a football club badly, this is really a handbook for anyone who would want to do it. If you just wanted to be hated by a giant swathe of the entire English people, you would go about it the way Mike Ashley did. Okay? As I said, he got Newcastle relegated, which hadn't happened in absolutely ages. And when they came back rubbish. Okay? They came back without having any of the success that they'd had previously. They had one very good year where they got into Europe. They finished in 5th and they did very well that year. But every other year since he took over in 2007 has been essentially a disappointment and a failure, fighting off relegation, trying desperately not to drop into the championship or actually dropping. He hired Rafael Benitez, who is a legend in managerial circles. And Benitez wasn't able to stop them from going down because things were so terrible. But he also wasn't able to do a lot of the things that he would have wanted to do to get that done, like hire the kind of players that he needed. And when he went down, he stayed. You know, this is a world-famous manager who could go and manage anywhere he wanted. People would buy him out of his Newcastle contract if it meant getting their hands on him. And he stayed to try to get back up out of the Championship into the Premier League. And it didn't work. And he ended up having his contract run down. They didn't try to re-sign him, even though he wanted to be there and he wanted to make it work. You can imagine how the fans would feel about that. Having one of the best managers in the world, but Mike Ashley going out of his way to make this not work out. It's terrible. It's really, really bad. And that's, not even the worst. The guy who got them back in the Premier League after they dropped with Alan Shearer got sacked right after he got them back into the Premier League. Everyone was angry. The management and running of the club was an absolute shambles. And that is why when somebody as terrible as Saudi Arabia comes calling, Newcastle United fans don't necessarily consider this to be an appalling stain on the history of their club. They probably should think that, for a lot of reasons we'll get into in a moment. But for the moment, what they really think is, I can't believe it might actually happen. Mike Ashley might be gone. He's been trying to sell the club for years. Nobody has paid enough for him to feel like he made enough money out of the deal. So he won't sell. He's not making much money out of it anymore. His plan to churn through players and make money in the transfer market didn't really make him the millions that he wanted. So he tried to sell the whole club for an inflated price, and of course nobody would pay it. And the fans were resigned to him just staying and wrecking up the place year upon year upon year because he wasn't going to make enough money to get gone. Well, finally, there's light at the end of the Mike Ashley tunnel, and they might get away with this, but unfortunately the light is Saudi Arabia, and that is not a good thing. The reasons you wouldn't want Saudi Arabia associated with your football club are many, and they're well known. The war in Yemen and its associated atrocities, executions, women's rights, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi are among the reasons. It takes a lot of sports washing to clean up the blood left by dismembering somebody with saws. But Saudi Arabia are willing to go big on this one, okay? It's not just buying Newcastle United. They hosted the Dakar Rally, which is an immense desert rally that used to take place to Dakar, on the way to Dakar in Western Africa, but can't now because of stability issues with several of the countries along the way. It now takes place in different locations around the world, and Saudi snapped it up recently. They had a heavyweight title fight with Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz Jr. in 2018. They have the Saudi Cup, that is the richest horse race in the world, which you can imagine how much money flies around at the richest horse race in the world, which they just invented. They dreamed it up. There's already enough money flying around in horse racing, but they just decided that they wanted some of the prestige associated with some of these massive racing events. They've hosted Phil Mickelson, the golfer, while several other top flight golfers stayed away. They've hosted Barcelona and Real Madrid in a cup final for kind of Spanish domestic football. That must have cost a huge amount of money, in the hundreds of millions. And it was a huge success for them. It was a big international event that a lot of people paid attention to. Some of the biggest footballers in the world played in that match. Slightly further down the way, in terms of prestige, they had Tyson Fury, current world heavyweight champion, make a WWE, pro wrestling appearance in Saudi Arabia. These events all put together cost a lot more than buying Newcastle United is going to cost them. Okay, it's rumored to be about 300 million. But the club is going to demand more and more investment over the coming years, in terms of hundreds and hundreds of millions more. That investment is going to bring footballing success on the pitch. It always does. Okay? But being seen to be able to afford that success is one of the most important things for Saudi Arabia. Okay? They are currently in a lot of trouble because they're seen to be on the wrong end of the recent oil price war with Russia, and oil prices have collapsed below zero. You now have to pay somebody if you want them to take oil off you. Okay? In order to show that they're still solvent and a good financial bet, Saudi Arabia are splashing cash around. Okay? There's realpolitik here. If they can show the world that they're still solvent, they can show Russia that their oil price war didn't do the kind of damage that Russia might have been hoping it would have. Newcastle United are now going to become a tool of Saudi Arabian politics, as well as just being a channel for kind of reflected glow of goodwill. So all that said, it's hard to understand Newcastle fans adding Saudi flags to their Twitter profiles, or sharing Mohammed bin Salman memes, and generally lauding the takeover as this wonderful thing. They're salivating over those hundreds of millions in cash and the promises of Champions League football again. Okay? But this is an order of magnitude above the Mike Ashley level of problems. You know, the problems with Saudi Arabia are a lot bigger than the problems with who is, relatively small time retail businessman here in the UK. Yes, he's got billions of pounds, but, the sway that you get from running Sports Direct and recently having bought House of Fraser is not quite the same as running a giant chunk of the international oil industry. Okay? We are moving from a level of ulterior motive beyond just trying to make some money out of it. Okay? And yet you've got Newcastle fans sharing pictures of themselves with tea towel keffiyehs. I mean, when you're putting a tea towel on your head in what would probably be seen as an inappropriate imitation of a minority culture, and you're trying to celebrate that, maybe that's kind of the measure of the kind of person who is absolutely dancing in the streets about this takeover. Okay? That maybe there's not a huge amount of sensitivity there. I don't know. Maybe it's perfectly acceptable to, dress up as an Arab these days. I'm not an Arab, I can't tell you that. But I do know that, as a rule, playfully imitating traditional ethnic dress is not looked well on by most of society these days. But these people are getting their contribution to the Saudi goodwill train in early, enthusiastically, before anyone's even signed anything. The sad truth is that success that Saudi are after will likely come, and it will be welcomed by the club and its supporters the same way it's been welcomed in other clubs that have become part of global sports washing. The reported 800 executions in Saudi Arabia since 2015 are not going to weigh much in the final measuring. Sadly, what might weigh quite significantly is beIN Sports. They're a Qatari TV network. Qatar and Saudi Arabia don't get on very well at the moment, to put it mildly. And beIN are taking up the fact that, according to them, according to beIN, who have a dog in this fight, let's say, but according to beIN, Saudi Arabia had been using pirated streams to broadcast Premier League games in Saudi Arabia. The reason that they were doing that was that beIN have the rights across the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia and beIN do not see eye to eye. beIN are part of the Qatari governing family. All these finances and all of these familial relationships and things are difficult to keep an eye on. But Qatar essentially is involved in PSG, Paris Saint-Germain. They were involved in the purchase of Neymar for 200 million quid. And they're involved in broadcasting Premier League TV in the Middle East. So putting one in the eye of beIN is something that you can imagine Saudi Arabia enjoying. So it's easy to believe that they may have been rebroadcasting illegal streams. But the fact is, the Premier League and the Football Association and anyone else involved in this is very unlikely to try to take a moral position on Saudi Arabia. After all, if they did that, they'd need to take a moral position on a lot of other stuff. There are rules in place that say that if somebody is guilty of an offence in a foreign country that would be a crime here in the UK, they can be prevented from becoming a director of a football club. But the idea that the FA is going to claim to know for a fact that the people controlling Saudi Arabia's domestic wealth fund are involved in, say, for instance, war crimes or murders, they're not going to make that call. So beIN Sports making an allegation that they know how to deal with, an allegation of football rights abuse, that might work. And it is a really sad state of affairs that the Premier League has arrived in a place where money and football rights or TV rights are a bigger call on their attention than human rights. But unfortunately, to draw a bow around this whole episode, it was ever thus. They were always interested in TV rights before anything else. They exist because of TV rights. There wouldn't be a Premier League if they didn't want to have control of those rights and the biggest slice of the financial pie from those rights. It's always been money, and it's never been people. They were happy with Blackpool when Blackpool were in the Premier League. They were happy with Mike Ashley, who, let's not forget, has been called in Parliament a man who runs his businesses like a Victorian workhouse. They were happy with Mike Ashley, but they were never happy with anyone who threatens them financially. They were always about the TV rights, and they will continue to be about the TV rights. It's very unlikely that this is going to be stopped at this point. It's very unlikely because of a multitude of reasons way beyond the scope of this podcast. You can imagine the United Kingdom as a whole does not want to offend Saudi Arabia right when it is striking out on its own, post-Brexit and so on. You can imagine that the same kinds of people who have been pally with, Saudi royals and Saudi representatives, in spite of everything it's been doing for years, are not going to suddenly change when they want to buy Newcastle. Newcastle is not special and different enough from everything that's been allowed to go ahead previously. This is going to happen. It shouldn't happen. It is blatantly obvious that this is bad for everybody involved. Newcastle aren't going to do well out of this, except potentially in silverware. This is going to put a giant question mark behind any success they have in the near future. And everyone is going to lose out. So this thing might destroy Newcastle United Football Club, or at least tarnish its legacy. But it's probably not going to destroy the world, right? Probably all of human achievement is not going to collapse into the dust because some Saudi royals decided it looks good to own Newcastle. Not really, no. Maybe the opening of the show, slightly hyperbolic. But the fact is, Saudi Arabia could cause untold damage to humanity. And I don't just mean climate change. I mean in general, in geopolitics, the stability of the world depends a lot on regimes that behave like Saudi Arabia being seen to be regimes that behave like Saudi Arabia. And this deal undermines that. And that's terrible. Anyway, it's Ev on everything, and you made it to the end of the show because you are awesome and have great powers of stamina. Thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Ev Buckley if you want to talk about the show. You can find the show itself on Twitter at Ev on everything, where you'll find some links to some of the things that we covered here, including Mike Ashley drinking a beer. Hope you enjoyed today's show. Hope you are keeping your hands washed and yourself safe. We will see you again on Tuesday. Bye bye.